The snowflake landed on Florence Parker's eyelash just as she stepped off the stagecoach in Independence, California, and she knew immediately that her carefully laid plans were about to crumble like week-old biscuits. It was December 23rd, 1876, and she had exactly 2 days to reach her cousin's ranch 30 miles north before Christmas morning. But the driver was already shaking his head and pointing at the darkening sky with a grim expression that told her everything she needed to know. "Miss, I cannot take you any further," the grizzled man said, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. "That mountain pass closes up tight when a storm comes through, and I've got a family waiting for me in town. You will need to find somewhere to stay until after Christmas, maybe longer depending on how much snow we get." Florence felt her heart sink into her worn traveling boots. She had saved for 6 months to afford this journey from Sacramento, leaving behind her position as a seamstress in a stuffy shop where the owner's son had become increasingly insistent about his unwanted attentions. Her cousin Margaret had written promising her work and a fresh start, but now she stood in the middle of a tiny mountain town with barely enough money for a week's lodging and no way to reach her destination. The other passengers dispersed quickly, clearly locals who knew their way home. Florence clutched her carpetbag tighter and looked around the small main street of Independence. The town sat in a valley surrounded by towering pine-covered mountains, their peaks already obscured by heavy gray clouds. A few weathered buildings lined the muddy road, including what appeared to be a general store, a saloon, a boarding house, and a small church with a crooked steeple. "The boarding house is run by Mrs. Carmichael," the driver said, taking pity on her obvious distress. "She is a fair woman, will not overcharge you. Good luck, miss." He tipped his hat and climbed back onto his perch, urging the horses toward what she assumed was the livery stable. Florence squared her shoulders and made her way toward the boarding house, trying not to think about how this would eat into her meager savings. The building was 2 stories, painted white but badly in need of fresh paint, with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Carmichael's Lodging, Clean Beds, Hot Meals." A bell jangled as she pushed open the door, and warmth enveloped her immediately. The front room served as both parlor and dining area, with mismatched chairs arranged around a pot-bellied stove that radiated blessed heat. A woman in her 50s emerged from what must be the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron and eyeing Florence with the assessing gaze of someone who had seen plenty of travelers in her time. "Stage got stopped by the weather?" Mrs. Carmichael asked without preamble. "Yes, madam. The driver said I would need to wait out the storm. I was hoping to reach my cousin's ranch before Christmas, but it seems that will not be possible now." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Where's your cousin's place?" "The Hendricks Ranch, about 30 miles north." Mrs. Carmichael shook her head. "That pass will be closed for at least a week once this storm hits, maybe 2. You're welcome to stay here, but I should tell you straight that it will not be cheap. Food is expensive this time of year with the roads so uncertain." Florence's stomach tightened, but she nodded. "I understand. I can pay. $2 a night, meals included. You can share a room with Miss Patterson who works at the general store, or pay $3 for your own room." $2 a night for potentially 2 weeks would consume nearly all her money. Florence did the calculation quickly and felt panic rising in her chest. "Is there any work available in town? I'm an excellent seamstress, and I can cook and clean." Mrs. Carmichael considered this, her weathered face thoughtful. "Most folks here do their own mending, but I suppose I could use some help around the place. I'm not as young as I used to be, and my back has been giving me trouble. I could take $1 off your rate each day if you help with the cooking and cleaning. Fair enough?" "More than fair. Thank you." Relief flooded through Florence, even though $1 a day was still more than she had hoped to spend. "Good. You can take the room at the top of the stairs, first door on the right. Get yourself settled, then come help me with supper. We have got 5 guests besides yourself, and they will be hungry." Florence carried her bag up the narrow staircase, her legs aching from the long journey. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a faded quilt, a washstand with a chipped pitcher and basin, and a single window that looked out toward the mountains. She could see snow falling more heavily now, fat flakes that danced and swirled in the wind. She allowed herself only a moment to sit on the bed and fight back the tears that threatened. This was not how she had imagined spending Christmas. She had pictured herself at Margaret's warm ranch house, surrounded by family and the promise of a new life. Instead, she was stranded in a strange town, watching her savings disappear, with no guarantee that the weather would clear in time for her to reach her destination before her money ran out entirely. But Florence Parker had not survived 22 years of hardship by giving in to despair. She splashed cold water on her face, pinned her dark blonde hair more securely, and went downstairs to help with supper. The kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of baking bread and simmering stew. Mrs. Carmichael put her to work immediately, peeling potatoes and carrots while the older woman tended to the bread. They worked in companionable silence for a while before Mrs. Carmichael spoke again. "You said you were a seamstress?" "Yes, madam. I worked in a shop in Sacramento for 3 years. That explains your fingers. I can always tell a seamstress by the calluses." Mrs. Carmichael pulled the bread from the oven with practiced efficiency. "We do not have much call for fancy sewing here, but folks do need practical mending. If you are staying a while, you might put up a notice at the general store. Cannot hurt to earn a little extra." "That is an excellent idea. Thank you." The guests began arriving for supper around 6 o'clock. First came Mr. and Mrs. Jensen, an elderly couple who lived in one of the rooms permanently because their children had moved to San Francisco and they were too old to manage a homestead anymore. Then Miss Patterson, the store clerk Mrs. Carmichael had mentioned, a thin young woman with worried eyes who barely spoke. 2 men came in together, miners by the look of their rough clothes and calloused hands, who nodded politely but focused entirely on their food. Florence helped serve the meal, ladling out generous portions of venison stew and setting out slices of fresh bread with butter. The guests ate with the focused attention of people who had worked hard all day, and the conversation was minimal. She was just beginning to think she had met everyone when the door opened again, bringing with it a gust of cold wind and swirling snow. The man who entered had to duck his head to clear the doorframe, and Florence found herself staring despite her best manners. He was enormous, easily over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill the doorway. Long, dark hair hung past his collar, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face, both dusted with snow. He wore buckskins and a heavy fur coat that made him look even larger, and when he moved, it was with the careful, deliberate grace of someone very aware of his own size and strength. "Evening, Mrs. Carmichael," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in Florence's chest. "Sorry I'm late. Had to check the traps before the storm gets worse." "No trouble, Dalton. Your supper is still hot. Sit yourself down." Mrs. Carmichael spoke to him with easy familiarity, clearly accustomed to his presence. The big man's dark eyes swept the room and landed on Florence. She felt pinned by that gaze, unable to look away even as heat crept up her neck. He nodded politely and removed his coat, revealing a red flannel shirt that stretched tight across his muscular chest and arms. Even without the coat, he was intimidating in his size and obvious strength. "This is Miss Parker," Mrs. Carmichael said. "Got stuck here by the storm. She will be helping me out until the pass clears." "Madam," Dalton said, inclining his head. His eyes were still on her, assessing in a way that made Florence feel exposed, though not threatened. There was nothing improper in his gaze, just an intensity that suggested he missed very little. "Pleased to meet you, mister." Florence trailed off, realizing she did not know his surname. "Dalton Norris, just Dalton is fine." He settled into a chair that creaked under his weight, and Florence hurried to ladle him a bowl of stew, very conscious of his proximity as she set it before him. "Thank you kindly," he said, and when she met his eyes again, she saw something that might have been amusement in their dark depths, as though he knew exactly how flustered she felt. Florence retreated to the kitchen, her heart beating faster than it should. She had met plenty of men in Sacramento, including some who were considered handsome, but none of them had affected her like this. Perhaps it was simply his size or the wildness that seemed to cling to him like his fur coat. Whatever it was, it left her feeling off balance and strangely warm despite the cold wind rattling the windows. She helped Mrs. Carmichael clean up after supper, washing dishes while the older woman put away leftovers. The guests dispersed to their rooms or the parlor, where Mr. Jensen was attempting to get a card game started. Through the doorway, Florence could see Dalton sitting alone near the window, whittling something from a piece of wood with a knife that looked almost delicate in his large hands. "Dalton lives up in the mountains," Mrs. Carmichael said, following her gaze. "Has a cabin about 5 miles from here. He is a trapper mostly, though he does some hunting and odd jobs when folks need help. Good man, even if he's not much for society. Does he stay here often? When the weather turns bad, he will take a room for a few days rather than risk being snowed in alone. Smart, if you ask me. These mountains can be deadly in winter. Mrs. Carmichael handed her another pot to wash. He has been coming here for 3 years now, ever since he showed up in Independence. Keeps to himself mostly, but he is always respectful and pays on time. That is more than I can say for some. Florence nodded, scrubbing at a stubborn bit of stuck-on food. She found herself wanting to know more about the mysterious mountain man, but could not think of a way to ask without seeming improper. That night, she lay in her narrow bed listening to the wind howl and the snow hiss against the window. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and even with the quilt pulled up to her chin, she could feel the cold seeping through the walls. She thought about Dalton Norris in his cabin in the mountains and wondered how anyone could survive in such isolation. What had brought him to this remote place? Did he have family somewhere, people who worried about him during storms like this? She thought too about Christmas, now just a day away. It would be her first Christmas away from the city, away from the familiar routines of church services and the shop owner's wife grudgingly providing a slightly better dinner than usual. She had imagined celebrating with Margaret's family, meeting new people, beginning her new life. Instead, she would spend it in a boarding house with strangers. Florence firmly pushed away the self-pity. She had faced worse disappointments and survived. She would make the best of this situation, just as she always had. The next morning dawned gray and bitter cold, with snow still falling steadily. Florence woke early out of long habit and dressed quickly, shivering in the unheated room. Downstairs, she found Mrs. Carmichael already in the kitchen, stoking the fire in the large cast-iron stove. "Good morning," the older woman greeted her. "Sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you. What can I do to help?" They fell into an easy rhythm, preparing breakfast for the guests. Florence mixed batter for flapjacks, while Mrs. Carmichael fried bacon and made coffee. The familiar tasks soothed her, reminding her that she had skills and could make herself useful anywhere. The guests trickled in as the smell of food filled the boarding house. Dalton was among the last to arrive, his hair damp as though he had been outside already. He caught Florence's eye and nodded a greeting before taking his seat. "How bad is it out there?" Mr. Jensen asked him. "Bad enough. Must be 8 inches already, and it is not showing signs of stopping. Anyone who does not need to be out should stay inside." Dalton accepted the plate of flapjacks and bacon Florence handed him with a quiet thanks. "Well, that settles it," Mrs. Carmichael said. "Christmas Eve indoors it is. At least we have plenty of food and wood for the fire." The day passed slowly, the boarding house taking on a strange suspended quality as the storm raged outside. Florence kept busy helping Mrs. Carmichael with various tasks, and in the afternoon she put up a small notice near the dining table offering her services as a seamstress. Miss Patterson immediately asked if she could mend a torn hem on her good dress, and Mrs. Jensen mentioned that her husband's shirts all needed buttons replaced. Florence settled in the parlor with her sewing basket, grateful for the work and the opportunity to earn a few extra coins. She was focused on Miss Patterson's hem when she became aware of someone settling into the chair across from her. She looked up to find Dalton watching her with that same intense gaze from the night before. "You do fine work," he said, nodding at the neat stitches she was making. "Thank you. It is what I know." She kept her eyes on her needle, unnerved by his proximity and the way he seemed to study her. "Mrs. Carmichael said you are heading to the Hendricks Ranch when the pass clears." "Yes, my cousin Margaret lives there with her family. She has offered me work." "That is a good ranch. Hendricks is a fair man." Dalton leaned back in his chair, which creaked in protest. "But the pass will not clear for at least 10 days, maybe longer. This is a big storm." Florence felt her stomach drop. 10 days would consume every penny she had, even with the reduced rate for helping Mrs. Carmichael. "I see. I could not help but notice your offer of sewing services. I have some things that need mending, if you are willing. My coat has a tear, and several shirts need buttons. I will pay fair." Relief flooded through her. "Of course. I would be happy to help." He stood and went upstairs, returning a few minutes later with an armload of clothes. The tear in his coat was substantial, a long rip in the leather that would require careful stitching. The shirts were rough homespun, the kind a man living alone in the mountains would make for himself, and they were missing various buttons or had seams that were coming apart. "This will take me some time," Florence said, examining the coat, "the leather work especially." "No rush. I'm not going anywhere in this weather." He paused, then added, "I appreciate it. Not many folks around here do this kind of work." Over the next few hours, Florence worked steadily while the other guests dozed or played cards. She was aware of Dalton sitting nearby, still whittling his piece of wood. Occasionally she would glance up to find him watching her, but he would look away quickly, focusing back on his work. There was something oddly companionable about the silence between them. "What are you making?" she finally asked, curiosity getting the better of her. He held up the wood, and she saw that it was taking the shape of a bird, wings spread as though in flight. "Hawk," he said. "For Mrs. Carmichael's granddaughter, she collects them." "It is beautiful. You are very talented." A faint flush colored his cheeks above his beard. "Just something to pass the time." "It is more than that. You have real skill." He ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise, and Florence found herself smiling. For all his size and obvious strength, there was something almost shy about Dalton Norris. That evening, Mrs. Carmichael announced that she was making a special Christmas Eve supper, and the boarding house filled with the rich smells of roasting chicken and baking pies. Florence helped set the table with the good china, and Mrs. Carmichael even produced a bottle of wine that she said had been saving for a special occasion. "We might be snowed in, but that's no reason not to celebrate," the older woman declared. The meal was festive despite the storm still raging outside. Even the normally quiet Miss Patterson seemed to relax a bit, and the miners proved to have a surprising repertoire of bawdy songs that made Mrs. Jensen blush and laugh. Dalton sat at the end of the table, mostly silent but with a small smile playing at his lips as he watched the others. After supper, Mr. Jensen produced a harmonica and played a few carols. They all sang, their voices blending in the warm room while the wind howled outside. Florence felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness at being far from where she had planned to be, but also something like contentment. These strangers had become a makeshift family for the holiday, and there was comfort in that. When the singing ended and people began retiring to their rooms, Dalton approached Florence as she was helping clear the dishes. "Thank you for working on my things," he said. "The coat especially. I know leather's not easy to work with. I am not finished yet, but I should have everything done by tomorrow afternoon." He nodded, then hesitated as though wanting to say something more. Finally, he said, "I hope your Christmas is not too disappointing, being stuck here instead of with your family." The kindness in his words caught her off guard, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful. I hope yours is pleasant as well. I usually spend it alone in my cabin, so this is better." He gave her a small smile that transformed his face, making him look younger and less severe. "Good night, Miss Parker. Good night, Mr. Norris, Dalton." His smile widened slightly at her use of his first name, and then he was gone, heading up the stairs to his room. Florence finished the dishes in a daze, her mind replaying their conversation. There was something about the mountain man that drew her, something beyond his obvious physical appeal. Perhaps it was the gentleness she sensed beneath his rough exterior, or the loneliness she recognized because it echoed her own. She went to bed that night thinking about him and woke on Christmas morning to silence. The wind had finally stopped, and pale sunlight filtered through her window. Florence lay still for a moment, savoring the rare luxury of not having to leap immediately out of bed. In Sacramento, Christmas morning had always meant an early start, attending church services and then returning to the shop to prepare for the after-Christmas sales. For the first time in her adult life, she had nowhere she needed to be. She dozed off again, exhaustion from the past days of travel and work catching up with her. When she finally woke properly, the sun was higher in the sky, and she realized with shock that it must be nearly 9 o'clock. She could not remember the last time she had slept so late, especially on Christmas morning. Florence dressed quickly, embarrassed to have been so lazy, and hurried downstairs. She found the dining room empty, the breakfast dishes already cleared away. Panic fluttered in her chest. Had she slept through breakfast? Would Mrs. Carmichael be angry that she had not helped? She rushed to the kitchen and stopped short in the doorway. Dalton stood at the stove, his broad back to her, doing something with a pan. He had removed his flannel shirt and wore only a thin undershirt that clung to the muscles of his back and shoulders, and Florence found herself staring at the play of those muscles as he moved. His long hair was tied back with a leather cord, and she could see the strong column of his neck. "Oh," she said, the small sound escaping before she could stop it. He turned quickly, and she saw surprise flash across his face before it settled into something warmer. "You are awake." "I'm so sorry. I cannot believe I slept so late. Where is Mrs. Carmichael? I should have been helping with breakfast." She gave everyone the morning off, said it was Christmas and we all deserved to rest. The other guests already ate, but I thought you might be hungry when you woke up. He gestured to the pan. "I'm making eggs and bacon. There's also bread and jam on the table." Florence felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. "You are making breakfast for me?" "Mrs. Carmichael said she had never seen you sleep past dawn since you arrived. Figured you needed it." He turned back to the stove, suddenly focused intently on the eggs. "Sit down. It is almost ready." She sank into one of the kitchen chairs, feeling oddly emotional. No one had made breakfast for her since she was a small child. She watched as Dalton deftly flipped the eggs, his large hands surprisingly graceful. He loaded a plate with eggs, bacon, and 2 slices of toasted bread, then set it before her with a mug of coffee. "Thank you," she said softly. "This is very kind." He shrugged, looking uncomfortable again. "It is nothing, just eggs." But it was not just eggs. It was the thoughtfulness of letting her sleep, of making sure she had a hot meal waiting. It was the care, evident in how he had arranged the food on the plate and poured her coffee just the way she liked it, with a splash of cream, because he must have noticed how she took it at breakfast the past few days. Florence ate slowly, savoring each bite, while Dalton leaned against the counter with his own cup of coffee. The kitchen was warm and quiet, the pale sunlight streaming through the window making everything seem softer, almost dreamlike. "The storm has passed," he said after a while, "but the snow is deep. It will take days for the road to be passable, even longer for the pass." "I understand." She did not feel as distressed by this news as she might have expected. "I am grateful for the work Mrs. Carmichael has given me, and the sewing commission's help." "About that," Dalton set down his coffee cup and met her eyes. "I have a proposition for you, if you are interested." Florence felt her heart beat faster. "What kind of proposition?" "My cabin is about 5 miles from here, up in the mountains. It is rough living, but I keep it warm and I have plenty of supplies. I could use someone to help with cooking and mending and such, someone who could stay through the winter. The pay would be room and board plus $2 a week, and I would bring you back to town come spring so you could head to your cousin's ranch." He spoke quickly, as though afraid she would interrupt. "It is all proper. You would have your own room, and I would not ever do anything to compromise your reputation. I just thought, with you needing money and me needing help, it might work out for both of us." Florence stared at him, her mind racing. The offer was generous, far more than she could hope to earn in town. $2 a week plus room and board for 4 months would leave her with more than $30 saved by spring, enough to give her a real cushion when she finally reached Margaret's ranch. But the thought of living alone in a mountain cabin with a man she barely knew was daunting, possibly even scandalous. "I know it is not conventional," Dalton continued, apparently reading her hesitation, "but I give you my word that you would be safe. I'm not looking for anything improper. I just get tired of my own cooking and my clothes falling apart." He gave her a rueful smile. "Truth is, I could use the company too. Gets lonely up there with no one to talk to for weeks at a time." There was something vulnerable in his admission, and Florence found herself softening. She thought about staying in town, watching her money dwindle, depending on Mrs. Carmichael's charity. Then she thought about the care Dalton had shown in letting her sleep and making her breakfast, the gentleness in his large hands as he carved the wooden hawk, the respect he had shown her from the moment they met. "I would need to think about it," she said carefully. "It is a significant decision." "Of course. Take all the time you need. The offer stands whenever you are ready." They sat in companionable silence for a while longer, Florence finishing her breakfast while Dalton cleaned the pan and put away the leftover food. She watched him move around the kitchen with easy familiarity, and she found herself imagining what it would be like to share a cabin with him, to cook meals together and sit by the fire on long winter evenings. The rest of Christmas Day passed in a pleasant blur. Mrs. Carmichael produced a magnificent roast goose for dinner, and Mr. Jensen entertained them all with stories of his prospecting days in the 1849 gold rush. Dalton gave Mrs. Carmichael the wooden hawk he had carved, and the older woman's eyes grew suspiciously bright as she turned it over in her hands, admiring the details. "My granddaughter will treasure this," she said. "Thank you, Dalton." Florence presented Mrs. Carmichael with a lace doily she had made from scraps of fabric, and the older woman insisted on using it immediately, placing it in the center of the dining table where everyone could admire it. That evening, Florence found herself sitting near the fire with Dalton, while the other guests dozed or retired early. She had finished mending his coat and shirts that afternoon, and he had paid her generously, adding an extra $1 that she had tried to refuse until he insisted. "Have you thought more about my offer?" he asked quietly, mindful of the others in the room. Florence had thought of little else all day. The practical side of her knew it was the smart choice financially, but there was more to it than that. Something about Dalton Norris called to her, made her want to know him better, to understand the man behind the quiet exterior. "I have conditions," she said finally. His dark eyes brightened with interest. "Name them." "First, I would need to send a letter to my cousin Margaret explaining the situation, so she knows I am safe and will arrive in the spring." "Done. I will take you to the post office myself tomorrow if the roads are clear enough." "Second, if at any point I feel uncomfortable or wish to leave, you will bring me back to town immediately. No questions asked." "Absolutely. You have my word." "Third, we would need to establish clear boundaries about sleeping arrangements and privacy. I would need a door that locks on my room. My cabin has 2 rooms. You would have complete privacy, and I can install a bolt on your door before we even head up there." Florence took a deep breath. "Then yes, I accept your offer." A slow smile spread across Dalton's face, and Florence felt her heart skip. "Thank you. I promise you will not regret this." She hoped he was right. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Dalton proved to be a man of his word, taking Florence to the general store to purchase supplies she would need for extended mountain living, including warmer clothes and sturdy boots. He insisted on paying for everything, saying it was part of her room and board, though Florence suspected he was simply being generous. She wrote a long letter to Margaret explaining the situation and assuring her cousin that she was safe and would arrive in the spring with money saved. She tried not to think about what Margaret would say if she knew Florence was planning to spend the winter alone with a mountain man. "Mrs. Carmichael pulled her aside the day before they were set to leave. "Are you sure about this, dear? Dalton is a good man, but that's a very isolated life up there." "I am sure," Florence said, more confident than she felt. "I need the money, and he has been nothing but respectful." The older woman studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "You are a smart girl. Trust your instincts. And if you need anything at all, you have Dalton bring you right back here. Understand?" "I understand. Thank you for everything, Mrs. Carmichael." On a bright, cold morning 3 days after Christmas, Florence found herself seated on a horse behind Dalton, her arms wrapped around his broad waist as they climbed into the mountains. Her few possessions were packed in saddlebags along with supplies Dalton had gathered. The snow was deep, but the sky was clear, and the horse picked its way carefully along a trail that only Dalton seemed to see. Florence had never been this close to a man before, and she was acutely aware of the warmth of his body, the solid strength of him, the way his muscles moved as he guided the horse. Her hands rested against his stomach, and even through the layers of clothes she could feel the hardness there. It made her feel strange, flustered and warm despite the cold air. They rode for hours, climbing steadily higher. The trees grew thicker, tall pines that blocked out much of the sky. Occasionally, Dalton would point out landmarks, a particular rock formation or lightning-struck tree, teaching her the path so she would know it if she ever needed to find her way back to town. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to dip toward the western peaks, they emerged into a small clearing. Florence caught her breath at the sight before her. The cabin was small but well built, constructed of thick logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and there were 2 windows with real glass in them, a luxury in these mountains. A small barn stood nearby, big enough for the horse and perhaps a cow or some chickens. The clearing afforded a stunning view of the valley below. the distant town of Independence barely visible through the trees. "It is not much," Dalton said, a note of uncertainty in his voice, "but it is solid and warm." "It is beautiful," Florence said honestly. He helped her down from the horse, his hands spanning her waist easily, and for a moment they stood very close, his hands still on her waist, her own gripping his shoulders for balance. Their breath made white clouds in the cold air, mingling together. Florence looked up and found him watching her with an expression she could not quite read, something intense and almost hungry, but also tender. Then he stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "Let me show you inside." The cabin's interior was dim after the bright snow, but warm from the fire Dalton must have banked before leaving for town days ago. There was one main room with a stone fireplace, a table and 2 chairs, a small kitchen area with a cast-iron stove, and shelves holding supplies and cooking implements. Everything was neat and organized, not what she would have expected from a bachelor living alone. "Your room is through here," Dalton said, opening a door on the far wall. The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed covered in furs, a chest for her belongings, and a small window that looked out on the forest. True to his word, there was a sturdy bolt on the inside of the door. "I will bring in your things and get the horse settled," Dalton said. "Make yourself comfortable. There is venison stew I made before I left in the pot by the fire. Help yourself if you are hungry." He left before she could respond, and Florence sank onto the bed, suddenly overwhelmed by what she had done. She was miles from town, alone with a man she barely knew, in the middle of a wilderness that could kill her if she made a wrong step. What had she been thinking? But as she sat there, listening to Dalton moving around outside, hearing his low voice as he spoke to the horse, she felt her panic subside. She had made this choice with her eyes open. She would make the best of it, just as she always had. By the time Dalton came back inside with her bags, Florence had composed herself. She helped him put away the supplies they had brought, learning where he kept things and how he organized his small domain. They worked together easily, falling into a rhythm that felt natural despite their newness to each other. That first evening, they ate the venison stew while Dalton told her about his life in the mountains. He checked his trap lines twice a week, hunted for meat as needed, and occasionally did odd jobs for ranchers in the area who needed help with heavy work. In the summer, he would sometimes guide wealthy men from back east who wanted to hunt in the mountains. But winter was his quiet time, just him in the wilderness. "What brought you here?" Florence asked. "To this life?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I was a soldier," he said finally. "Fought in the war, saw things I wish I could forget. When it was over, I could not go back to regular life, to towns and people and noise. I needed space, quiet, a place where the only things I had to worry about were whether I had enough wood for the fire and food for the winter. Been here 3 years now. First peace I have known in a long time." Florence heard the pain in his voice and understood. Everyone carried scars, visible and otherwise. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. He met her eyes across the firelight. "Thank you for listening." That night, Florence lay in her small room listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the mountain forest. Wind in the pines, the occasional crack of a branch heavy with snow, the soft settling noises of the cabin adjusting to the night cold. She thought she heard Dalton moving around in the main room for a while, then silence. She wondered what he was thinking, if he regretted bringing her here, if he found her presence disruptive. Then she pushed those thoughts away and focused on sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. She would face them as they came. The next weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Florence woke early each morning to find Dalton already up, stoking the fire and making coffee. They would eat breakfast together, then he would head out to check his trap lines while she cleaned the cabin and prepared food for the day. He taught her how to cure meat, how to make soap from fat and lye, how to tan hides so they stayed soft and supple. She taught him nothing, but he seemed to enjoy her company anyway, talking more than she suspected he had in months. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Florence sewing or knitting while Dalton carved or repaired his equipment. Sometimes they talked about their lives before, carefully avoiding the painful parts. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying not being alone. Florence found herself looking forward to his return each day, watching for him through the window as evening approached. When he appeared at the edge of the clearing, her heart would lift in a way that had nothing to do with mere companionship. She was falling for him, she realized, with a mix of excitement and fear, for this gentle giant who could snap a rabbit's neck with his bare hands but carve delicate birds from wood, who had seen horrors in war but still treated her with unfailing kindness. She did not know if he felt the same. He was always respectful, never touching her beyond what was necessary for daily life, never saying anything that could be construed as improper. But sometimes she would catch him watching her with that intense gaze, and she would wonder what he was thinking. January turned to February, and the snow showed no signs of letting up. They were truly snowed in now, the path to town completely impassable. Florence should have felt trapped, but instead she felt strangely free. For the first time in her life, she was not working herself to exhaustion for someone else's benefit. Yes, she cooked and cleaned for Dalton, but he worked just as hard, and he treated her as a partner, not a servant. They shared the labor of survival, and there was satisfaction in that. One evening in mid-February, a blizzard hit with sudden ferocity. Dalton had just returned from checking the trap lines when the wind picked up, howling around the cabin with a fury that made the walls shake. Snow drove horizontally across the clearing, erasing the world beyond the windows. "This is bad," Dalton said, checking the door to make sure it was securely barred. "Could last days. Good thing we have plenty of supplies." They ate dinner listening to the storm rage outside. Florence tried not to show her fear, but she jumped when a particularly violent gust made the whole cabin shudder. Dalton noticed and moved his chair closer to hers. "We are safe," he said. "This cabin has weathered worse storms. I built it to last." "You built it yourself?" "Every log and stone. Took me a whole summer, but I wanted it done right." Florence looked around with new appreciation. The cabin was a testament to his skill and determination. "You should be proud. It is a wonderful home." "It has been lonely, though," he said quietly. "Until now." Their eyes met, and Florence felt the air between them grow charged. The storm howled outside, but inside the cabin felt warm and safe, a bubble of intimacy in the hostile wilderness. Dalton's hand moved on the armrest of his chair, as though he wanted to reach for her but held himself back. "Dalton?" she said softly, not sure what she wanted to say, but needing to break the tension. "Oh, Florence!" He did reach for her then, his large hand covering her much smaller one where it rested in her lap. "I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered in her chest. "What is it?" "I know I promised this was just business, that I would not make things complicated. But I cannot keep pretending I do not feel anything for you." The words came out in a rush, as though he had been holding them back for too long. "You are the first thing I think about when I wake up, and the last thing before I sleep. When I'm out checking the traps, I hurry back because I want to see you. I love the way you hum while you cook, the way you bite your lip when you concentrate on sewing, the way you laugh at my terrible jokes. I am falling for you, Florence. Hell, I think I already fell." Florence felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were happy tears. "I feel the same way. I have for weeks now, but I thought it was just me." "That you could never feel that way about someone like me." "Someone like you?" Dalton looked genuinely confused. "You are beautiful and kind and brave. You left everything you knew to start over, and you have not complained once about this hard life. Why would I not fall for you?" "I am nobody, just a seamstress with no family and no prospects. You are somebody to me." He lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest, where she could feel his heart beating strong and fast. "You are everything to me." Florence felt something break open inside her, all the loneliness and fear she had carried for so long cracking apart under the weight of his words. She reached up with her free hand and touched his bearded cheek, feeling the rough texture against her palm. "Kiss me," she whispered. Dalton leaned down slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Florence did not want to. She wanted this, wanted him, with an intensity that surprised her. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle at first, almost tentative, as though he was afraid of frightening her. But Florence pressed closer, and the kiss deepened, becoming hungry and desperate, weeks of suppressed longing pouring out between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this right," he said. court you properly, even if we are stuck in this cabin, marry you if you will have me." Florence pulled back so she could see his face. "Are you proposing?" "Yes. I know it is fast and we have not known each other long, but out here, you learn to recognize what matters. You matter, Florence. You are what I have been looking for without knowing it. So yes, I am proposing. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Florence said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her again, and this time there was joy in it, a celebration of their future together. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, everything was perfect. They spent the next 3 days snowed in together, the blizzard making it impossible even to open the door. But Florence did not mind. They talked for hours, learning everything about each other, sharing the stories they had been too cautious to tell before. Dalton told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 15, about the horrors of war and how they had broken something in him that this mountain solitude was slowly healing. Florence told him about her own lonely childhood, her parents dying in a tenement fire when she was 12, the years of working her fingers bloody in various shops and homes, always trying to save enough money for something better. "You will never have to work like that again," Dalton promised. "I will take care of you." "We will take care of each other," Florence corrected, and he smiled and kissed her again. They slept in separate rooms still, maintaining propriety even though they were engaged, but they spent every waking moment together. Dalton taught her to play chess using pieces he carved from wood. She read to him from the few books he owned, her voice bringing the stories to life. They cooked together, cleaned together, simply existed together in perfect harmony. When the storm finally cleared, and Dalton was able to dig them out, they decided they could not wait any longer to make their union official. Dalton proposed riding to town as soon as the path was passable to find someone to marry them. "There is a circuit preacher who comes through Independence," he said. "If we are lucky, he might be snowed in there. If not, we will have to wait until spring." They made the journey to town in early March, when the snow had melted enough to make the path treachable. Mrs. Carmichael was delighted to see them, even more so when Dalton announced their intention to marry. "I knew it," the older woman crowed. "I saw the way you two looked at each other. About time you figured it out." The circuit preacher was indeed still in town, and he agreed to perform the ceremony that very afternoon. It was a simple affair, held in Mrs. Carmichael's parlor with the boarding house guests as witnesses. Florence wore her best dress, and Dalton had trimmed his beard and tied his hair back. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her with such tenderness that Florence heard Mrs. Carmichael sniffle behind them. They stayed in town that night, Mrs. Carmichael insisting on giving them her best room for a wedding gift. Florence lay in Dalton's arms for the first time as his wife, feeling safe and cherished in a way she never had before. He made love to her with the same gentleness he showed in everything, murmuring words of love against her skin, bringing her pleasure she had not known existed. "I love you," she whispered afterward, tracing patterns on his broad chest. "I did not know I could be this happy." "I love you too," he replied, pulling her closer. "You are my miracle, Florence Norris." Florence Norris. She tested the name silently and found she loved the sound of it. They returned to the mountain cabin the next day, and now it truly felt like home. Florence rearranged things to suit them both, combining their belongings in the larger room that was now theirs together. The small room where she had slept became storage for supplies and furs. As winter gradually released its grip and spring began to creep into the mountains, they talked about the future. Florence wrote to Margaret explaining that she had married and would not be coming to work at the ranch after all. Margaret's response, when it finally arrived in early April, was cautiously congratulatory, saying she was happy Florence had found love even if the circumstances were unusual. Dalton proposed expanding the cabin, adding another room or two before next winter. "I am hoping we might need the space," he said, his hand resting on Florence's still flat stomach with a meaningful look. Florence blushed, but did not discourage him. She wanted children, wanted to fill this cabin with life and love. The thought of bearing Dalton's children, of watching him gentle his great strength to hold a baby, made her heart swell. As the snow melted and the first green shoots began to appear, Dalton taught Florence to ride so she could accompany him on his rounds. They explored the mountains together, and he showed her secret places he had discovered, a waterfall hidden in a canyon, a meadow where deer came to graze in the early morning, a hot spring where they could bathe even in winter. One evening in late April, they sat outside the cabin watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Florence leaned against Dalton's chest, his arms wrapped around her, feeling perfectly content. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Giving up the life you planned for this one?" Florence thought about the cousin she had never met, the ranch she had never seen, the life she had imagined for herself. Then she thought about the life she had instead, this quiet existence in the mountains with the man she loved. "Not for a moment," she said. "This is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Dalton tightened his arms around her and kissed the top of her head. "I thank God every day for that storm that stranded you in Independence. Best thing that ever happened to me." "To both of us," Florence agreed. As spring turned to summer, the mountains came alive with color and sound. Dalton's trap lines became less productive as the animals came out of hibernation and were easier to hunt. He began preparing a vegetable garden near the cabin, breaking the hard earth and building raised beds. Florence planted seeds they had purchased in town, tending them carefully, excited to grow their own food. In June, Florence discovered she was pregnant. Dalton was overjoyed, his face lighting up with such pure happiness that Florence felt tears in her eyes. He became even more protective, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavier chores. Florence both appreciated and was exasperated by his hovering, but she knew it came from love. They spent the long summer days preparing for the baby and the winter ahead. Dalton hunted and smoked meat, chopped and stacked wood, reinforced the barn and cabin against the coming cold. Florence preserved vegetables from the garden, sewed baby clothes from soft fabric Dalton purchased in town, and knitted tiny hats and booties. In the evenings they would sit outside watching the stars, Dalton's hand resting on Florence's growing belly, talking about their hopes and dreams for their child. "What should we name the baby?" Florence asked one night. "If it is a boy, I was thinking about Thomas after my father. If it is a girl, maybe Grace?" "Thomas Norris, Grace Norris, both sound perfect." As autumn painted the mountains in gold and red, Florence's belly grew round and full. The baby kicked strongly, and Dalton would talk to it, his deep voice rumbling against Florence's skin. She had never imagined she could feel so complete, so perfectly at peace with her place in the world. In October, Dalton made a trip to town to stock up on supplies before winter set in. He returned with gifts for Florence, soft fabric for her to make a new dress, a book of poetry, and a beautiful carved cradle he had commissioned from the town's carpenter. "This is too much," Florence protested, though she was touched by his thoughtfulness. "Nothing is too much for you and our baby," Dalton said firmly. "I want you to have everything you need." Winter came early that year, snow falling in late October and continuing through November. Florence's belly was huge now, and the baby was due in December. Dalton refused to leave the cabin for more than an hour at a time, worried that Florence might go into labor while he was gone. "I am fine," she kept telling him. "Women have been having babies for thousands of years. We know what to do." "That does not mean I want you doing it alone," he replied stubbornly. On a cold morning in mid-December, 2 days before Christmas, Florence woke to contractions rippling across her swollen belly. She lay still for a moment, timing them, before gently shaking Dalton awake. "It is time," she said simply. Dalton was out of bed immediately, his face going pale under his beard. "Are you sure? What do you need? Should I go get someone?" "We cannot go anywhere in this snow, and there's no time anyway. The baby is coming today." Florence spoke calmly, though inside she felt her own share of fear. "Help me up. I need to move around." The labor was long and hard, lasting through the day and into the night. Dalton stayed by her side the entire time, letting her squeeze his hands until she surely hurt him, though he never complained. He brought her water, helped her walk when she needed to move, held her when the contractions grew too intense. Finally, as midnight approached on December 17th, their son came into the world with a lusty cry. Dalton caught him with steady hands, tears streaming down his face as he placed the baby on Florence's chest. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered, his voice breaking. "You are perfect. Thank you, Florence. Thank you for this gift." Florence looked down at her son, at his tiny red face and shock of dark hair, and felt love like nothing she had ever experienced. "Hello, Thomas," she murmured. "Welcome to the world." They spent the next days in a haze of exhaustion and joy, learning the rhythms of their new son. Thomas was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in long stretches. Dalton was completely besotted, spending hours simply watching the baby sleep, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes. On Christmas morning, Florence woke to find Dalton gone from their bed. She could hear him moving around in the main room, being unusually quiet. She fed Thomas and got dressed, then carried the baby out to investigate. The sight that greeted her made her stop in her tracks. Dalton had clearly been up for hours. The cabin was decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, making it festive despite their isolation. The table was set with their best dishes, and the smell of cooking food filled the air. Dalton stood at the stove, his back to her, making breakfast. "Merry Christmas," she said softly. He turned, a smile breaking across his face. "Merry Christmas. I was hoping you would sleep a bit longer. You've been up so much with Thomas." "What is all this?" "Well, last Christmas you slept late for the first time, and I made you breakfast. I thought we should make it a tradition." He came over and kissed her, then carefully took Thomas from her arms so she could sit down. "Besides, you have been taking such good care of our son. You deserve a morning to be spoiled." Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "You are too good to me." "Impossible. You deserve the world, and I'm just trying to give you a small piece of it." They ate breakfast together, Thomas sleeping peacefully in his cradle nearby. After, Dalton presented Florence with gifts he had made or purchased, a new warm shawl, a journal for her to record Thomas's milestones, and a beautiful silver locket that he said was his mother's. "I want you to have it," he said, fastening it around her neck. "You are part of this family now, and she would have loved you." Florence gave him a scarf she had knitted and a new shirt she had made from fabric he had brought home months ago. But her real gift was something different. She handed him a folded piece of paper, watching his face as he opened it. It was a drawing she had made of the three of them, Dalton standing behind her chair, Florence holding Thomas. She was not a trained artist, but she had captured the essence of their little family, the love and contentment that filled their cabin. "This is beautiful," Dalton said, his voice rough. "I will treasure it always." That afternoon, with Thomas sleeping, they made love slowly and tenderly, reconnecting after the weeks of Florence's recovery. Afterward, they lay tangled together, talking about the future. "I was thinking," Dalton said, "that we should make a trip to town in the spring, show off our son, let people see what a beautiful family we have made. I would like that, and maybe we could visit my cousin Margaret. I would like her to meet you and Thomas. Whatever you want, love, I just want you to be happy." "I am happy," Florence assured him, "happier than I ever dreamed possible." The winter passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes and sleepless nights, but also of quiet joy. Florence had never known she could love someone as much as she loved her son and her husband. Watching Dalton with Thomas, seeing this strong mountain man reduced to gentle murmurs and silly faces by a tiny baby, made her fall in love with him all over again. In early February, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. She was surprised, having not expected it to happen so soon, but Dalton was delighted. "We will have a full house before we know it," he said, pulling her into his arms. "That addition to the cabin cannot wait any longer." He spent the rest of winter drawing plans for expanding the cabin, adding 2 more bedrooms and enlarging the main living area. When spring came and the snow melted, he began the construction, working long hours while Florence tended Thomas in the vegetable garden. By summer, the addition was complete, and the cabin had truly become a house. Florence decorated the new rooms, hanging curtains she had sewn, and arranging the furniture Dalton had built. It was starting to feel like a real home, a place where a family could grow and thrive. In June, they made the journey to town, Thomas now 6 months old and growing fast. Mrs. Carmichael was beside herself with joy at seeing the baby, and half the town seemed to stop by the boarding house to get a look at the mountain man's son. They also traveled to the Hendricks Ranch to visit Margaret. Florence's cousin was warm and welcoming, though she could not hide her shock at the life Florence had chosen. But when she saw how happy Florence was, how devoted Dalton was to his wife and son, she relaxed. "I am glad you found love," Margaret told Florence, even if it was not in the way any of us expected. He is a good man. The best, Florence agreed. They returned to the mountain in mid-July, and Florence spent the rest of the summer preparing for the new baby. Thomas was walking now, toddling around the house and getting into everything. Dalton had built a small fence around the vegetable garden to keep him out, and Florence spent hours watching her son explore the world with wide-eyed wonder. Their daughter was born in late October, just as the first snow began to fall. The labor was shorter this time, and Grace Norris came into the world with her mother's blonde hair and her father's dark eyes. Thomas, not quite understanding what had happened, stared at his baby sister with confusion, before reaching out to gently pat her head. "Baby," he said, one of his first clear words. "Yes, your baby sister," Florence told him, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be such a good big brother." Dalton held both his children, one in each arm, his face a picture of awed disbelief. "How did I get so lucky?" he asked. "What did I do to deserve this?" "You were you," Florence said simply. "Kind and good and strong. You saved me, Dalton, from loneliness and fear and a life of drudgery. You gave me this beautiful life." "You saved me too," he replied. "I was just existing before you came along. Now I am truly living." The years that followed were full and rich. Grace grew into a lively, curious child who followed her father everywhere, wanting to help with every task. Thomas was quieter, more thoughtful, with his mother's gentle nature. They were joined by a third child, a son they named James, when Grace was 2. The house on the mountain became known in the region, and people would sometimes make the trek up to ask Dalton for help with various tasks. He had a reputation as someone who could fix anything and was willing to help anyone who asked. Florence, too, gained a reputation for her skilled sewing, and women would send fabric up with their husbands, asking her to make dresses or shirts. Every Christmas morning, Florence would wake to find Dalton already up, making breakfast and decorating the house. It became their tradition, his way of showing love and letting her rest. The children would wake excited, rushing to see what small gifts their parents had made for them, and the day would be filled with laughter and warmth. When Thomas turned 6, Dalton began teaching him to read using the few books they owned and some that Florence ordered from a catalog. Grace demanded to learn as well, even though she was only 4, and Florence spent hours teaching her letters. They wanted their children to have opportunities they had not, to be able to choose their own paths in life. As the children grew older, they began to understand how unusual their life was, how different from the families in town. But they never seemed to mind. The mountain was their home, and they could not imagine living anywhere else. One evening when Thomas was 12, Grace was 10, and James was 8, Florence and Dalton sat on the porch watching the sunset while their children played in the clearing. Grace was teaching her brothers some complicated game involving sticks and stones, her voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Do you think they will stay here?" Florence asked. "Or will they want to leave, see the world?" "I think they will do whatever makes them happy," Dalton replied. "We will support them either way, but I hope at least one of them stays. I like the idea of this place being in the family for generations." "I like that idea too." Florence leaned against him, still fitting perfectly in the curve of his arm after all these years. "Do you remember that first Christmas when you made me breakfast?" "How could I forget? That was when I knew I had to tell you how I felt. I could not keep it inside any longer." "I am glad you did. I am glad for all of it, even the storm that stranded me in Independence. Everything led me to you." Dalton kissed the top of her head, a gesture so familiar and comforting that Florence felt tears prick her eyes. "We have built a good life, Florence Norris." "The best life," she agreed. As the children grew into young adults, the house on the mountain became a gathering place for the community. Thomas, who had inherited his father's size and strength, became known for his skill with horses and helped break and train them for local ranchers. Grace, who had her mother's gift with a needle, began making beautiful quilts that people came from miles around to purchase. James, the youngest, had a way with growing things and transformed the small vegetable garden into a productive plot that yielded more food than the family could eat, selling the surplus in town. Florence and Dalton watched their children flourish with quiet pride. They had given them roots and wings, a strong foundation, and the freedom to fly. When Thomas married a local girl and brought her home to the mountain, Florence wept happy tears, grateful that at least one of her children would carry on the legacy they had built. Grace chose to remain unmarried, devoted to her art and her independence, though she never moved far from the family home. James eventually started his own ranch in the valley, close enough to visit regularly, but far enough to forge his own path. As Florence and Dalton grew older, their love only deepened. They had weathered hardships and celebrated joys, had built something lasting from that chance meeting in a boarding house so many years ago. The mountain that had once seemed so isolating became their sanctuary, a place where they had created not just a home, but a legacy. Every Christmas morning, without fail, Dalton would wake early and make breakfast for his wife. Even when his hair turned gray and his hands grew stiff with age, he maintained the tradition. It was his way of honoring that first Christmas when he had let her sleep late for the first time in her life and realized he was in love with her. On their 20th Christmas together, Florence woke to find Dalton sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her with that same intense gaze he had given her so many years ago in Mrs. Carmichael's boarding house. "Merry Christmas, love," he said softly. "Merry Christmas? You're not making breakfast?" "Already done. The children will be arriving soon with the grandchildren. But I wanted a moment alone with you first." He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around hers. 20 years ago today, I made you breakfast for the first time. 20 years ago, I told you I loved you. It has been the greatest honor of my life to be your husband, to build this life with you." Florence felt tears stream down her face. "The honor has been mine. You gave me everything, Dalton. A home, a family, a purpose. You loved me when I thought I was unlovable. You cherished me every single day. That was easy. You made it easy." He leaned down and kissed her, slow and sweet, the kiss of a man who knew his wife's taste as well as his own. "I love you, Florence Norris. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. I love you too, always." They sat together for a while longer, holding hands and remembering. The boarding house in Independence where they had met. The cabin that had seemed so small at first, but had held so much love. The children they had raised, the life they had built. All of it precious, all of it cherished. Then they heard the sounds of arrival, horses and voices, and the excited squeals of grandchildren. Thomas had 3 children now, 2 boys and a girl. They burst into the house with typical enthusiasm, demanding to know where Grandpa and Grandma were, eager to see what Christmas surprises awaited. Florence and Dalton rose to greet them, ready to fill the house with the noise and chaos and joy of family. But first, they shared one more kiss, a private moment of love before the day swept them up. As Florence walked into the main room, her children and grandchildren gathered around, the smell of Dalton's breakfast filling the air. She felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her life had not gone according to plan. She had never expected to marry a mountain man, to live in the wilderness, to build a family in such isolation. But it had been perfect. Every hardship, every joy, every quiet morning and wild storm, all of it had been exactly what she needed. She had found her place in the world, and more importantly, she had found her person. The man who made her breakfast on Christmas morning, who held her through the night, who had given her the life she had always dreamed of, but never knew how to ask for. As the grandchildren clamored for attention, and Grace helped serve breakfast and Thomas told some long story about a difficult horse he was training, Florence caught Dalton's eye across the crowded room. He smiled at her, that private smile that was hers alone, and she smiled back, her heart full to bursting. She had never slept late on Christmas morning until she met her mountain man. He had let her sleep and made her breakfast, and in doing so had shown her what love really looked like. Not grand gestures or pretty words, but simple acts of kindness and care, repeated faithfully over the years until they became the foundation of a life. And what a life it had been. What a beautiful, unexpected, perfect life. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm of seasons in the mountains. Florence and Dalton aged together gracefully, their bodies slowing but their love never dimming. They became the heart of a growing family, their house on the mountain, a symbol of stability and devotion that their children and grandchildren aspired to. Thomas and his wife Emma eventually took over most of the day-to-day running of the homestead, But Florence and Dalton remained active, tending the garden and helping with the grandchildren. Grace's quilts became famous throughout the region, displayed in homes as far away as Sacramento. James's ranch prospered, and he married a wonderful woman who fit seamlessly into the family. On their 30th anniversary, the entire family gathered for a celebration. Children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren filled the expanded house to capacity. There was music and dancing and more food than Florence had seen in one place outside of town, festivals. As evening fell and the younger children were put to bed, Florence and Dalton slipped away to their favorite spot on the porch. The view had not changed in 3 decades. The same mountains, the same forests, the same vast sky filled with stars. But they had changed, gray-haired and lined with age, softened by time but strengthened by love. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if that storm had not hit?" Dalton asked. "If you had made it to your cousin's ranch as planned?" Florence considered this. "I think I would have had a good life. Margaret is kind, and I would have worked hard and probably been content, but I would never have known what I was missing. I would never have known you, and that would have been the greatest tragedy of all." "I was half a person before you," Dalton said. "Just going through the motions, existing but not really living. You made me whole, Florence. You gave me purpose and joy, and a reason to face each day with hope instead of just endurance." "We saved each other," Florence said. "That is what love is supposed to do." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel overhead. Inside, they could hear the murmur of their children's voices, the occasional laugh, the sound of family, their legacy, their gift to the future. Florence thought about that young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Independence 30 years ago, frightened and alone, her plans in ruins. If she could speak to her younger self, what would she say? That everything works out? That hardship leads to happiness? No, she decided. She would tell her to trust herself, to take chances, to recognize love when it appeared even in unexpected forms. She would tell her that the best things in life are often not the things we plan for, but the things that find us when we are open enough to see them. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, reading her expression in the way only a long-time spouse could. "How grateful I am. For all of it. Every moment, every challenge, every joy. This life we built together is my proudest accomplishment." "Mine too," Dalton agreed. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You are my greatest adventure, Florence Norris, my grand romance, my everything." They sat together until the cold drove them inside, where the fire still burned and family waited, where home was and always would be, as long as they had each other. And on the next Christmas morning, as he had for 31 years, Dalton woke early and made breakfast for his wife, letting her sleep late, showing his love in the simplest and most profound way possible. The tradition continued year after year, a testament to a love that had started with a snowstorm and a stranded seamstress, and had grown into something beautiful and lasting and true. Florence and Dalton lived into their 80s, rare for their time and place, remaining sharp and engaged with the world until the end. When Dalton passed away peacefully in his sleep one cold March morning, Florence grieved deeply, but also celebrated the full life they had shared. She lived only 6 months longer, as though her heart knew it was time to follow the man who had been her partner in all things. They were buried on the mountain they loved, side by side under tall pines with a view of the valley below. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered to celebrate their lives, telling stories of their devotion and the legacy they had left. The house on the mountain remained in the family, passed down through generations as a reminder of what love could build. And every Christmas morning, the tradition continued, husbands waking early to make breakfast for their wives, honoring the example Dalton and Florence had set so many years before. Because that was what true love looked like. Not perfect people living perfect lives, but imperfect people choosing each other every single day, in small ways and large, building something beautiful from simple acts of kindness and care. A seamstress and a mountain man brought together by chance, held together by choice, creating a love story that would echo through the generations. It had started with a storm and a stranded young woman and a quiet man offering her work. It had grown into a breakfast made with love on a Christmas morning. and it had become a lifetime of devotion, a family, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. That was the greatest gift of all, not the life Florence had planned, but the life she had lived, the one she had built with Dalton Norris, her mountain man, her love, her home. And if she had never slept late on any Christmas morning before she met him, she had spent 30-plus years waking to breakfast made with love, to a man who cherished her enough to let her rest, to show his devotion in the simplest way. That was worth everything. That was the truest kind of happily ever after.